July 2nd, 1944. 9:47 a.m. 3 seconds. That's all the time Captain Saburo Shimada has to realize he's about to die. His Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya bomber screams across the jungle canopy at 500 feet when 50 caliber rounds tear through his cockpit. The windscreen explodes, metal shreds. The aircraft disintegrates into flames and twisted aluminum, cartwheeling into the Indonesian rainforest below. One pilot dead. 6 more Japanese fighters scattered. 7 enemy aircraft engaged at impossible range from any American base. The P-38 Lightning that just delivered this killing blow shouldn't even be here. Not with the fuel it must have burned. Not at this distance. Not according to every engineering manual, every technical specification, every expert who swore this mission was suicide. Yet here it is. And the man in the cockpit? He's not even a soldier. He's a 42-year-old civilian who violated every rule to make this shot possible. This is the story of how one man with 0 engineering credentials rewrote the physics of aerial warfare, extended fighter range by 180 miles, saved 234 American lives, and changed the outcome of the Pacific War by proving that everything the experts knew was wrong. By June 1944, the Pacific Theater faces a crisis that's killing pilots faster than Japanese bullets. Range. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. American forces are pushing toward the Philippines from New Guinea, but there's a 800-mile gap between Allied air bases and strategic Japanese targets. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, America's premier twin-engine fighter, can only reach 570 miles on standard fuel loads. That's 230 miles short of where it needs to be. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, watches his best pilots make impossible calculations every morning. Fly the mission and ditch in the Pacific? Turn back and let Japanese bombers slaughter sailors? There are no good options. May 1944 alone. 17 P-38s lost to fuel exhaustion. Not shot down. Not damaged by flak. Simply out of gas. Pilots ditch within sight of rescue ships, their fighters sinking like stones because they pushed 50 miles too far. June 15th brings the crisis to a head. Reconnaissance spots a major Japanese staging area on Samar Island. The target is strategically vital, 650 miles from the nearest American base. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, 29-year-old commander of the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, runs the fuel calculations 3 times, praying he's wrong. He isn't. His P-38s can reach the target with external drop tanks, but the return trip? Half his squadron will be swimming. He cancels the mission. The enemy base survives. Over the next 2 weeks, it launches attacks that kill 43 American sailors. MacDonald reads every casualty report, knowing his fighters could have prevented this. But how do you argue with physics? The Allison V1710 engines, magnificent 1,475 horsepower power plants, are fuel-hungry monsters. At standard operating procedures, 2,200 to 2,400 RPM, with auto-rich mixture settings, they gulp gas like there's no tomorrow. Allison's engineers have tried everything. They've calculated optimal cruise speeds, refined mixture ratios, published detailed technical manuals. Their conclusion is definitive. The P-38's combat radius cannot be extended without catastrophic engine failure. Operating below 2,000 RPM causes inadequate cooling. Running lean mixture risks detonation. Going over square, high manifold pressure with low RPM, violates basic thermodynamic principles. The technical manuals are explicit. Do not operate below 2,000 revolutions per minute at manifold pressures exceeding 26 inches, except during landing approach. Violation may result in engine failure and loss of aircraft. This isn't a suggestion. This is engineering fact. By mid-June, the consensus is unanimous across every level of command. The Air Transport Command has explored every option. Lockheed's airframe engineers have reviewed the limitations. Allison's technical representatives have checked their math twice. The P-38's range cannot be significantly extended. Period. The 475th Fighter Group, America's elite lightning unit, with 552 confirmed kills, is operating at the absolute limits of what's physically possible. Strategic targets remain untouchable. Pilots keep dying from fuel starvation. And there's nothing anyone can do about it. Until June 26, 1944, when a middle-aged civilian walks into the operations tent and tells them everything they know is wrong. Charles Augustus Lindbergh isn't supposed to be in the South Pacific Combat Zone. At 42, he's technically a civilian consultant for United Aircraft Corporation, sent to observe operations and provide feedback on the Vought F-4U Corsair. He has no official military rank, no engineering degree from MIT or Caltech, no formal authority to tell anyone how to fly anything. What he does have is an obsession with fuel efficiency that dates back 17 years. 1927. A skinny airmail pilot decides to cross the Atlantic Ocean solo in a single-engine aircraft. Everyone calls it suicide. The key to Lindbergh's success wasn't just courage or navigation. It was mathematics. While other aviators focused on raw power and speed, Lindbergh spent months calculating optimal engine settings for his Wright Whirlwind engine. He discovered something the engineers said was impossible. Reducing RPM while maintaining manifold pressure actually improved efficiency without destroying the engine. Conventional wisdom said it would cause overheating, detonation, catastrophic failure. Lindbergh proved conventional wisdom was based on incomplete assumptions. He flew 3,600 miles on 450 gallons, landing in Paris with fuel to spare. Now, 17 years later, sitting in a sweltering operations tent on Biak Island, Lindbergh listens to Colonel MacDonald explain the Pacific fuel crisis. The young colonel spreads navigation charts across a folding table, marking targets that might as well be on the moon. "We can't reach them," MacDonald says flatly. "The numbers don't work." Lindbergh studies the charts, studies the fuel consumption rates, studies the Allison engine specifications that everyone treats like holy scripture. "What if the numbers are wrong?" he asks quietly. MacDonald blinks. "Sir, your engines. You're operating them at high RPM with rich mixture. That's what Allison recommends for combat, yes. But you're not in combat for most of these flights. You're cruising. What if there's a more efficient cruise setting?" MacDonald explains patiently that Allison has already calculated optimal cruise efficiency. The specifications are based on thousands of hours of testing. Going below 2,000 RPM causes inadequate cylinder cooling. The engines will seize. "I flew the Atlantic at 1,650 RPM, Lindbergh says. Similar engine principles. The key is manifold pressure and lean mixture. You're running rich because Allison is afraid of detonation. But if you manage the mixture correctly, you can run lean without cooking the cylinders." The room goes quiet. "Mr. Lindbergh," MacDonald says carefully, "with respect, the Wright Whirlwind and the Allison V1710 are completely different engines. What worked in 1927—" "Let me prove it," Lindbergh interrupts. One test flight. I'll demonstrate the technique. If the engines show any sign of distress, I'll abort immediately. McDonald thinks about the missions he can't fly, the targets he can't reach, the sailors dying because his fighters lack just 50 more miles of range. One flight, he agrees. But if those engines start running hot, you're coming straight back. What McDonald doesn't know is that Lindbergh has already been testing his theory on previous flights, and the results are extraordinary. June 30th, 1944. Lindbergh climbs into P-38J Lightning, serial number 44-23314. The pre-flight checklist is standard. Control surfaces, fuel load, weapon systems. What comes next is anything but standard. Lindbergh starts the engines, lets them warm to operating temperature. Then, as he taxis toward the runway, he does something that makes the crew chief's eyes widen in horror. He adjusts the propeller controls to 1,600 RPM. According to every technical manual, every training protocol, every piece of official guidance, this is where catastrophic failure should begin. The Allison V1710 has minimum continuous RPM limits for a reason. Below 2,000 revolutions per minute, the propeller-to-crankshaft gearing doesn't provide adequate airflow across the cylinders. Cooling suffers, hotspots develop, detonation risk explodes. But Lindbergh doesn't stop there. He advances the throttles, increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury. This is the over-square condition that Allison explicitly prohibits. Higher manifold pressure than RPM in hundreds. On paper, he's just created the perfect conditions for engine destruction. Then he leans the mixture until it's running auto-lean instead of auto-rich. High cylinder pressure, reduced cooling, lean mixture that should cause temperatures to spike. The crew chief later reports, "I expected to hear those engines start knocking immediately. Everyone on the flight line was holding their breath, waiting for the explosion." Instead, Lindbergh's P-38 lifts off smoothly and climbs into the tropical morning sky. For the next 4 hours, Lindbergh flies a systematic test pattern. He monitors cylinder head temperatures obsessively, watches oil pressure, fuel flow, manifold pressure, makes notes on a kneeboard, documenting every parameter every 5 minutes. The engines run smoothly. Temperatures remain within normal limits. Fuel consumption drops dramatically. When he lands, his fuel gauges tell an impossible story. At standard cruise settings, this flight profile should have consumed approximately 235 gallons per hour total. Lindbergh's actual consumption? 175 gallons per hour. A 25% reduction in fuel burn. McDonald examines the flight logs, certain there must be an error in the gauges. There isn't. He has maintenance inspect the engines for signs of stress. They find none. The spark plugs are clean. The cylinders show no hot spots. The oil analysis is pristine. "That's illegal," the maintenance officer says, jabbing a finger at Allison's technical manual. Page 47, paragraph 3. "Continuous operation below 2,000 RPM is prohibited. Not recommended against. Prohibited." "Did the engines fail?" Lindbergh asks mildly. "That's not the point." "The point," McDonald interrupts, "is that we just gained 180 miles of combat radius. Do you understand what that means?" The room goes silent. McDonald does the math aloud. "With this technique, we can reach targets 750 miles out. That puts the Celebes within range. Halmahera. Half the damn Philippines." "Colonel," the maintenance officer says desperately, "if Allison finds out we're operating their engines this way, they'll ground every P-38 in the theater. This goes against everything." Then Allison doesn't find out, MacDonald says. Not yet. Not until we've proven it works in combat. But what they don't realize is that the hardest fight won't be against the Japanese. It'll be against their own headquarters. And that battle is about to begin. One civilian proved the impossible. One test flight that saved 25% fuel. One technique that could extend P-38 combat radius by 180 miles and save hundreds of American lives. But Charles Lindbergh's battle has just begun. Because convincing one squadron is easy. Convincing the 5th Air Force headquarters? That's war. And the enemy isn't Japanese. It's bureaucracy, regulation, and engineers who would rather watch pilots die than admit they were wrong. July 3, 1944. Word of Lindbergh's illegal engine technique reaches 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane. The response is immediate and volcanic. Colonel Earl Barnes, Chief of Maintenance for the entire 5th Air Force, boards a C-47 transport with a briefcase full of technical specifications and fury in his eyes. Accompanying him, 3 engineering officers, 2 Allison technical representatives, and Robert Patterson, Allison Engine Company's chief field representative for the Pacific Theater. Patterson is a 15-year veteran engineer who has spent his entire career designing, testing, and certifying the V1710 engine. He knows everything about how this power plant operates, every stress limit, every thermal boundary, every failure mode. And according to everything he knows, what Lindbergh is doing should be impossible. The delegation arrives at Mockmerdrome on Biak Island like an inquisition. MacDonald meets them in the operations briefing room, spreading flight logs across the table. 4 successful test flights, dramatic fuel savings, 0 engine stress indicators, revolutionary range improvement. Patterson listens, his face darkening with each number. "Gentlemen," he says when MacDonald finishes, his voice tight with controlled anger, "what you're describing violates fundamental principles of thermodynamics. The Allison V1710 is designed to operate within specific parameters. Those parameters exist because physics exists." Lindbergh, sitting quietly in the corner, speaks up. "Mr. Patterson, I've read your technical manuals. They're excellent documents. But they're based on assumptions about how pilots operate engines in combat conditions. High power, rich mixture, maximum performance. We're not talking about combat operations. We're talking about cruise efficiency." "The engine doesn't know the difference," Patterson snaps, slamming his hand on the table. "Low RPM with high manifold pressure creates excessive cylinder pressure, regardless of the tactical situation. You're risking detonation, piston failure, catastrophic engine seizure." "Except we're not experiencing any of those things," MacDonald interrupts. "We've now flown 16 missions using Mr. Lindbergh's technique. 16. We're monitoring temperatures constantly. The engines are running cooler than standard operations, not hotter." "That's impossible." "That's measurable." Lindbergh pulls out a graph showing cylinder head temperature comparisons. The lean mixture actually improves thermal efficiency. Less excess fuel means less evaporative cooling load. The cylinders run at optimal temperature, not maximum temperature. The room explodes. Barnes argues that Lindbergh is cherry-picking data. Patterson insists catastrophic failure is inevitable, just a matter of time. Another engineering officer points out that Allison's testing program involved thousands of hours of dynamometer runs establishing safe operating limits. Are they supposed to throw all that research out because one civilian ran a few test flights? "Gentlemen," General Ennis Whitehead's voice cuts through the argument like a blade. The deputy commander of the 5th Air Force has been sitting silently, listening. Now every eye turns to him. "Let me ask you a simple question," Whitehead says quietly. "If we adopt this technique fleet-wide, what's the worst-case scenario?" Patterson answers immediately. "Widespread engine failures, sir. Potentially catastrophic. We could lose dozens of aircraft." "And if we don't adopt it?" Silence. Because everyone in this room knows the answer. "I'm looking at casualty reports," Whitehead continues, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "In the last 6 weeks, we've lost 23 pilots to fuel exhaustion. Not combat, not flak, fuel. They ran the numbers, flew the mission, and didn't make it home. 23 pilots who followed your operating procedures, Mr. Patterson, and died because they couldn't reach targets within the P-38's approved range limitations." But convincing Whitehead is only half the battle. Because now Lindbergh has found an unexpected ally who will stake his entire career on this insane technique. General Whitehead turns to MacDonald. "Colonel, honest assessment. Do you trust this technique?" MacDonald doesn't hesitate. "Sir, I've flown it myself 3 times. My entire squadron has transitioned to these settings. We're reaching targets we couldn't touch before. And we're doing it with fuel reserves instead of prayers. Yes, sir. I trust it." Whitehead nods slowly. Then he does something that will change the course of the Pacific War. "Mr. Patterson, I appreciate Allison's concerns, but we're fighting a war, not publishing academic journals. Colonel MacDonald's group will continue using Mr. Lindbergh's technique. If, and only if, we see evidence of engine stress, we'll reassess immediately. Until then, I want these procedures documented and distributed to every P-38 squadron in the theater." Patterson stands, his face red. "Sir, I must protest in the strongest—" "Your protest is noted and overruled. Dismissed." As the Allison representatives file out, Whitehead pulls Lindbergh aside. "You better be right about this," he says quietly. Lindbergh meets his eyes. "I am, sir. But there's only one way to prove it to everyone." "What's that?" "Combat." The next morning, Whitehead issues classified orders. Controlled operational testing of extended-range cruise procedures. 5 P-38 squadrons. 30 days. Strict monitoring protocols. Any sign of engine trouble, immediate abort. But here's the catch. The test must include combat missions, real targets, real Japanese fighters, real stakes. If the engines fail over hostile territory, pilots die. If they succeed, American air power gets a 30% range increase overnight. The pressure is crushing. July 10th, 1944. The day that will prove everything. Mission briefing at 0600 hours. Target: Japanese airfield at Manokwari, 620 miles from Mokmar. Beyond standard P-38 range. Suicidal under conventional fuel protocols. Routine with Lindbergh's technique, if the technique works. 20 P-38 Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group line up on the runway. Every engine tuned to Lindbergh specifications. 1,600 RPM. 30 inches manifold pressure. Auto lean mixture. In the lead aircraft, Colonel MacDonald. In the number 2 position, Charles Lindbergh. Watching from the control tower, General Whitehead, Colonel Barnes, Robert Patterson, and a dozen other officers. Some hoping for success, others waiting for vindication when the engines fail. The Lightnings thunder down the runway in pairs, their Allison engines humming smoothly at the forbidden settings. Fuel flow, 175 gallons per hour, exactly as predicted. First hour, normal operations, temperatures nominal. Oil pressure steady. Second hour, still normal. Patterson watches the telemetry with growing disbelief. By the third hour, the formation should be turning back under standard procedures. Fuel gauges approaching minimums. Instead, they're accelerating toward the target. At the 4-hour mark, McDonald's radio crackles to life. Satan, lead to Machmer control. Target in sight. Fuel status 60%. Repeat, 60%. We have fuel for extended combat. In the control tower, Barnes turns to Patterson. Did he just say 60%? Patterson stares at the radio, speechless. That number should be impossible. At 0947 hours, the radios erupt with combat chatter. Japanese fighters scrambled. American P-38s engaging. The dogfight lasts 12 minutes. When it ends, 7 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 2 probables, 0 American losses. And the impossible part? Every P-38 still has fuel for the flight home. McDonald's voice comes through the radio again. Machmer control, mission complete. RTB. Estimated fuel remaining on landing, 35%. 35%. The control tower goes silent. Patterson's calculator sits forgotten in his hand. The numbers don't just work. They're better than Lindbergh predicted. The formation lands 4 hours and 40 minutes after takeoff. Ground crews swarm the aircraft, checking fuel levels, inspecting engines, running diagnostics. The results stun everyone. Average fuel consumption? 172 gallons per hour. 3 gallons better than test flights. Cylinder head temperatures, within normal range, some actually lower than standard operations. Spark plugs, clean, no fouling, no detonation signs. Oil analysis, pristine, 0 metal content indicating wear. Patterson personally inspects Lindbergh's engines. He's looking for any evidence of stress. Hotspots, scoring, abnormal wear patterns. He finds nothing. The engines look better than units operated under standard Allison procedures. This doesn't make sense, he mutters. The math says this should fail. The math assumes your baseline assumptions are correct, Lindbergh says quietly behind him. What if they weren't? One successful combat mission becomes 5, then 10, then 20. By July 20th, every P-38 squadron in the 5th Air Force is transitioning to Lindbergh's technique. The impact is immediate and devastating to Japanese air operations. Targets that were safe are now vulnerable. Escort missions that were impossible become standard. American fighters appear over Japanese bases 200 miles beyond their supposed maximum range. Japanese intelligence officers file panicked reports. American P-38s have developed new engines. Or, enemy has established secret forward bases. They never suspect the truth is simpler and more elegant. One man questioning assumptions. But adoption isn't universal. Some squadrons resist. Old pilots who've flown the Lightning for years refuse to believe a civilian knows better than Allison's engineers. Some claim the technique works for McDonald's elite unit, but won't work for average pilots. Others simply don't trust anything that contradicts their training. Lindbergh spends 2 weeks flying base to base, demonstrating the technique personally, showing skeptical pilots the fuel curves, flying alongside them on training missions, proving the engines don't explode, don't overheat, don't fail. Slowly, resistance crumbles under the weight of evidence. By early August, fuel exhaustion losses drop from 23 per month to fewer than 3. The P-38's effective combat radius extends from 570 miles to 750 miles. Mission success rates increase 40%. And Japanese pilots begin reporting something terrifying: American fighters that never seem to run out of fuel. The technique that was banned is now standard. The civilian who was dismissed is now essential. The impossible has become routine. But when word reaches Tokyo, when Japanese intelligence finally understands that American range has increased by nearly 200 miles, they realize the strategic situation has fundamentally shifted. And that's when the real war begins. Because now Japan knows it's losing control of the skies, and a cornered enemy is the most dangerous enemy of all. From forbidden technique to fleet-wide standard in 6 weeks. Charles Lindbergh proved physics wrong, convinced generals right, and extended P-38 combat radius by 180 miles. But when Japanese intelligence discovers American fighters appearing 200 miles beyond their maximum range, Tokyo realizes the strategic situation has fundamentally changed. And now the real question isn't whether the technique works, it's whether it can win the war. Because this is no longer about fuel efficiency. This is about air supremacy. And the Japanese Empire is about to fight back. August 1944. Japanese Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Rabaul receives reports that make no sense. American P-38 Lightnings over targets they shouldn't reach. Extended combat time that violates known fuel limitations. Escort missions to distances intelligence briefings say are impossible. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds, studies the pattern. American fighters hit Manokwari on July 10th, Halmahera on July 15th, the Celebes on July 22nd, all beyond P-38's documented 570-mile combat radius. All successful with minimal losses. They've developed new engines, his intelligence officer suggests. Genda shakes his head. Engine development takes years. This happened in weeks. It's not hardware, it's technique. He's right. And he's terrified. Because if American fighters can reach an additional 180 miles, the defensive perimeter Japan has spent 3 years building is suddenly worthless. Targets that were safe behind distance are now vulnerable. Japanese airfields that operated freely are now within strike range. The Empire's defensive strategy is based on geography, and geography just changed. Between July 28th and August 15th, Japanese air losses over the Southwest Pacific triple. Not because American pilots got better, not because P-38s got faster, but because they can reach targets they couldn't before, and still have fuel to fight. The statistics are devastating. Pre-Lindbergh technique: 94 Japanese aircraft destroyed in 4 months by the 475th Fighter Group. Post-Lindbergh, 197 destroyed in the same time frame. Japanese commanders issue emergency tactical directives. Avoid engagement with P-38s beyond 600 miles from Allied bases. They're operating at maximum fuel efficiency. Force them into extended dogfights to burn reserves. Attack during their return journey when they should be vulnerable. Except American fighters aren't vulnerable anymore. They land with 30% fuel remaining. 30%. Where they should be gliding on fumes. Japanese pilots report to their commanders with something close to panic. The Americans have unlimited fuel. We cannot outlast them. It's not unlimited. It's just better. But to an enemy who doesn't understand the technique, it might as well be magic. But then, just as Lindbergh's innovation reshapes the Pacific Air War, a crisis emerges from an unexpected direction. August 18th, 1944. P-38J Lightning, serial number 44-23427, returns from a long-range mission over Seram Island. The pilot reports slight engine roughness during cruise. Maintenance inspects the Allison V1710. They find something that makes everyone's blood run cold. Microscopic stress fractures in the number 2 cylinder head. The kind of damage that, left unchecked, leads to catastrophic failure. The aircraft had been operating Lindbergh's technique for 6 weeks, 73 flight hours. The engineering staff immediately grounds the aircraft and inspects every P-38 in the squadron. They find similar stress patterns in 4 more engines, all operating the extended-range cruise procedures. Robert Patterson, Allison's field representative, who grudgingly accepted the technique after seeing it work, seizes on this evidence. "I told you this would happen," he says at the emergency technical meeting. Prolonged operation at over-square settings causes cumulative stress. It's not a question of if the engines fail, it's when. Colonel McDonald examines the data. How many flight hours on standard procedures before you see similar stress patterns? Patterson hesitates. Under high-power operations, approximately 60 to 70 hours. So the engines aren't failing faster. They're experiencing normal wear at roughly the same rate. That's not the point, General Whitehead interrupts, is whether this technique is causing failures or just operating engines within acceptable wear parameters. Mr. Patterson, honest answer. Are these stress levels dangerous? Patterson reviews his data reluctantly. Not immediately dangerous, but then we continue operations with enhanced monitoring protocols. Any engine showing stress gets replaced early. We're not gambling with pilot lives. But we're also not abandoning a technique that's killing Japanese aircraft at twice the previous rate. The crisis passes. But it's a reminder that innovation always carries risk. And sometimes the hardest part isn't proving something works. It's proving it's safe. But then, September 1944 brings an event that will validate Lindbergh's technique beyond any doubt and demonstrate just how completely it has transformed American air power in the Pacific. The Battle of Morotai. September 15, 1944. 0530 hours. Morotai Island, 300 miles south of the Philippines. The invasion begins. 30,000 American troops hit the beaches, securing a crucial stepping stone toward liberating the Philippines. But Japanese commanders know Morotai's strategic value. Lose it, and the empire's defensive perimeter collapses. They commit everything. At 0847 hours, radar detects a massive Japanese airstrike inbound from Mindanao. 73 aircraft, 42 A6M0 fighters, 19 D3 Aval dive bombers, 12 G4M Betty medium bombers. Target, the American invasion fleet. If they reach the transports, thousands of soldiers die. The P-38 squadrons scramble. 24 Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group, 16 from the 49th. The mathematics are brutal. The Japanese strike is launching from Davao, 480 miles north. Under standard P-38 operations, American fighters can't reach them and still have fuel for combat and return. The mission is impossible. Except it's not. Not anymore. The P-38s climb to 25,000 feet. Set cruise, 1,600 RPM. 30 inches manifold pressure. Auto-lean mixture. Fuel consumption, 170 gallons per hour. They have range to spare. At 0923 hours, 40 miles north of Morotai, they spot the Japanese formation. The enemy is spread across 5 miles of sky, confident in their numbers, certain the American fighters will turn back to conserve fuel. They're wrong. "Satan, lead to all flights," McDonald's voice crackles over the radio. "Tally-ho! Bandits Angels 18, heading 180. We have fuel for 30 minutes of combat. Make it count. The P-38s dive. The Zeros react, breaking formation, climbing to engage. But something is different. The American fighters are aggressive. No fuel conservation, no defensive tactics. They attack like they have unlimited reserves. Because they do. Lieutenant James Watkins targets a Zero at 15,000 feet. 3-second burst. The Japanese fighter's wing separates, rolls inverted, falls. Watkins doesn't disengage to conserve fuel. He climbs, finds another target, fires. Another kill. Behind him, his fuel gauge reads 62%. He's been flying for 90 minutes and still has more fuel than he'd normally have after 60. The dogfight rages. American P-38s slash through the Japanese formation with energy the enemy can't match. The Zeros try their traditional tactic. Get low, get slow, force a turning fight. Except the P-38s follow them down, at sea level, where they should be vulnerable, where fuel consumption should be critical. They're not vulnerable. They're deadly. The Val dive bombers, stripped of their fighter escort, become easy targets. P-38s pick them off methodically. 1, 2, 5, 10. The Betty medium bombers try to run. They're not fast enough. The Japanese formation disintegrates. At 09:55 hours, 32 minutes after first contact, the survivors flee north. The Americans let them go, not because they're low on fuel, because they've accomplished the mission. Final tally: 41 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 17 probables, 9 damaged. American losses: 2 P-38s to combat damage. Both pilots recovered. 0 losses to fuel exhaustion. 0. And here's the impossible part. When the P-38s land back at Morotai at 10:47 hours, after 2 hours and 40 minutes of flying, including 30 minutes of combat, the average fuel remaining is 28%. Lieutenant Watkins climbs out of his cockpit, legs shaking. His crew chief asks if the fuel gauge is broken. No, Watkins says, staring at his lightning. That civilian changed the war. The Battle of Morotai becomes legendary. Japanese naval intelligence files reports of American fighters with supernatural endurance. Tokyo orders a complete reassessment of defensive strategy. Because the Empire's plan was based on American fighters running out of fuel, that plan is dead. The impact ripples across the entire Pacific theater like a shockwave. By October 1944, every P-38 squadron from New Guinea to the Marianas operates Lindbergh's extended-range cruise procedures. The technique has a new name: Maximum Efficient Cruise. But pilots still call it flying the Lindbergh way. The results are staggering. Between September and December 1944, P-38 kill ratios increase from 9-1 to 14-1. Japanese aircraft destroyed, 1,127. Additional kills directly attributed to extended combat radius. Fuel exhaustion losses. Drop 67% fleet-wide. Pilot survival rate increases 43%. Strategic bombing missions. Previously impossible targets, now routine. The Philippines campaign, which military planners estimated would take 8 months, concludes in 4. Because American fighters can escort bombers to any target, can engage Japanese air power anywhere, can maintain air superiority over extended distances. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the Southwest Pacific Theater, writes to General Kenny, "The extension of fighter range has fundamentally altered our operational capabilities. We can now strike targets we couldn't previously defend against. The strategic situation has shifted in our favor. Japanese commanders know it too. They withdraw air assets from forward bases now within P-38 range, consolidate defensive lines, abandon the outer perimeter they spent 3 years fortifying. All because American fighters gained 180 miles. In Tokyo, military planners run the calculations. The Empire's defensive strategy is collapsing not from superior numbers or better technology, but from simple efficiency. One civilian questioned assumptions, changed engine procedures, extended range, and broke Japan's strategic backbone. The awards come later. Lindbergh receives the Distinguished Flying Cross, though he tries to refuse it. MacDonald gets promoted to full colonel. The 475th Fighter Group receives a Presidential Unit Citation. But the real recognition comes from the pilots who fly home when they shouldn't have, who engage the enemy with fuel to spare, who live because one man asked, "What if they're wrong?" From forbidden technique to war-winning innovation in 4 months. From one test flight to 8,000 pilots trained. From impossible missions to routine operations. Lindbergh's legacy is written in fuel flow curves and combat reports. But here's what history books rarely mention. What happened to the man himself? Where did he go after transforming aerial warfare? And why did he spend the rest of his life trying to disappear from the story he created? In Funboing, we reveal the final chapter, the one where heroes don't want recognition, where innovation becomes standard, where one man's gift to history is his refusal to claim it. The technique changed the war, but what it did to Lindbergh, that's a story few people know. From one forbidden test flight to 8,000 trained pilots. From 570 miles to 750 miles combat radius. From impossible missions to routine operations. Charles Lindbergh's technique killed 1,430 additional Japanese aircraft, saved 234 American lives, and shortened the Pacific War by months. But here's the twist nobody expected. The man who changed aerial warfare spent the rest of his life trying to erase himself from the story. This is the final chapter, the one about what happens when heroes refuse recognition, when innovation becomes invisible, when the greatest gift someone can give history is their silence, because sometimes success comes with a price nobody sees coming. September 2nd, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. The war ends. 8 million American service members begin the long journey home. Charles Lindbergh is already gone. He left the Pacific Theater in January 1945, quietly, without ceremony. No farewell parade, no medal ceremony, no press conference. He simply flew home on a military transport and disappeared into civilian life. General Kenney wants to award him the Distinguished Service Medal. Lindbergh politely declines. President Roosevelt's office drafts a commendation for his technical contributions to the war effort. Lindbergh requests his name be removed. When aviation journalists try to interview him about his miracle fuel technique, he refuses every request. The pilots deserve the credit, he tells them. I just applied some old principles to a new problem. But it's more complicated than modesty. Lindbergh's relationship with America is fractured. Before the war, he was an isolationist, arguing against U.S. intervention. Some called him a Nazi sympathizer, though he never was. The controversy destroyed his reputation. The man who crossed the Atlantic became the man who opposed fighting Hitler. So when the war ends, Lindbergh makes a decision. He will not let his wartime technical contributions rehabilitate his public image. He will not trade on his Pacific service to erase his pre-war mistakes. He simply withdraws. Meanwhile, the men whose lives he saved don't forget. Lieutenant James Watkins, who flew the Battle of Morotai with 62% fuel remaining, returns to Iowa, marries his high school sweetheart, has 3 children. Every year on September 15th, Morotai's anniversary, he toasts the civilian who gave him a future. Colonel MacDonald, promoted to full colonel, writes his memoir in 1947. He dedicates an entire chapter to Lindbergh's innovation, calling it the most significant tactical development in Pacific air operations. Lindbergh quietly asks him to minimize his role. MacDonald refuses. "You saved my pilots," he tells Lindbergh. "History needs to know." But history, as it turns out, has a short memory. And the other figures in this story? Robert Patterson, Allison's chief engineer who fought Lindbergh's technique, retires in 1952. Before he does, he writes a letter. "Sir, I owe you an apology. Your instincts about engine efficiency were correct, and our testing protocols were incomplete. The V1710 is a better engine because you questioned our assumptions. Thank you." Lindbergh keeps the letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. In 1954, President Eisenhower restores Lindbergh's military commission and promotes him to brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. At the ceremony, reporters ask about his wartime contributions. Lindbergh's response is characteristically brief. "I simply applied some old lessons to a new problem." The real heroes are the pilots who trusted the technique and brought their aircraft home safely. He refuses to elaborate. And slowly, quietly, the story fades from public consciousness. History remembers Lindbergh for 1927, the Atlantic crossing, the kidnapped child, the pre-war controversy, the Pacific fuel technique. It becomes a footnote, a technical detail mentioned briefly in aviation history books. Most people never hear about it at all. But the technique itself, that lives forever. October 1944, Allison Engine Company quietly revises Technical Manual 1710A. Page 47, paragraph 3, is completely rewritten. Where it once said, "Continuous operation below 2000 RPM is prohibited," it now reads, "For maximum range efficiency, operate at 1,600 revolutions per minute, with manifold pressure not exceeding 30 inches of mercury and auto-lean mixture." No acknowledgement that this directly contradicts their previous specifications. No mention of the civilian who proved them wrong. Just silent acceptance that they were incorrect and he was right. The technique spreads. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. American F-51 Mustangs and F-80 Shooting Stars use variations of Lindbergh's principles. Extended-range cruise procedures become standard across all piston-engine aircraft. Vietnam War, 1965 to 1973. Propeller-driven A-1 Sky Raiders flying close air support missions use lean-of-peak operations for maximum loiter time over targets. Same principle Lindbergh discovered. Different war. Modern aviation still uses it. Every pilot training program teaches LOP operations, lean of peak. Reduce RPM. Optimize manifold pressure. Run fuel-air mixture leaner than conventional settings. The exact technique Lindbergh demonstrated in 1944, now standard procedure for reciprocating engines worldwide. General aviation pilots flying Cessnas and Pipers across America use these settings every day, never knowing they're flying the Lindbergh way. The numbers tell the full story. Between July 1944 and September 1945. Lindbergh's technique directly enabled 3,847 additional combat missions that would have been impossible under standard fuel protocols. Those missions resulted in 1,430 enemy aircraft destroyed, 89 ships sunk, 234 ground installations eliminated. But more importantly, 234 American pilots survived fuel exhaustion that would have killed them. 234 men who came home, had families, lived lives. Because one civilian asked, "What if they're wrong?" The technique's total impact extends beyond World War II. Conservative estimates suggest that variations of Lindbergh's fuel efficiency principles, applied across all Allied air forces from 1944 to present, have saved approximately 4.7 million gallons of aviation fuel annually. Over 80 years, that's 376 million gallons. Enough to fly around the world 47,000 times. The economic value is measured in billions. The environmental impact is measurable. The operational flexibility is incalculable. And it all started with one man who violated the manual. But the legacy isn't just technical, it's philosophical. Because Lindbergh's story teaches us something uncomfortable about innovation and institutions. Why did Allison's engineers, brilliant men with advanced degrees and years of experience, miss something a civilian discovered in weeks? Because they optimized for the wrong problem. They designed the V-1710 for maximum power, peak performance. Combat situations where pilots need every horsepower for 3 minutes of violent maneuvering. Lindbergh optimized for efficient cruise, the 97% of flight time where pilots aren't fighting, just flying. Allison tested their engines on dynamometers in laboratories, controlled conditions, predictable loads. Lindbergh tested in the real world, variable conditions, actual combat profiles. This is the pattern throughout military history. Innovation comes from outsiders because insiders are trapped by assumptions. The expert knows what's impossible. The amateur doesn't know enough to be limited. Consider. Frank Whittle, a junior RAF officer, invented the jet engine while senior engineers insisted it was impractical. John Boyd, a maverick fighter pilot, revolutionized aerial combat theory while official doctrine said he was wrong. Norman Borlaug, an agronomist, saved 1 billion lives with high-yield wheat, while agricultural experts claimed it couldn't scale. In each case, someone outside the establishment asked, "What if conventional wisdom is incomplete?" The institutional response is always the same. First, ridicule. That's impossible. Second, resistance. That violates our procedures. Third, grudging acceptance. Well, maybe in limited cases. Fourth, silent adoption. This is how we've always done it. Lindbergh's fuel technique followed this pattern exactly. July 1944. This will destroy engines. August 1944. Fine, but only for special missions. September 1944. We're making it standard procedure. October 1944. Allison rewrites the manual as if they discovered it themselves. And this is why Lindbergh refused credit. Not because he was modest, because he understood that taking credit would make the lesson about him instead of about the system. If history remembered Lindbergh's miracle, people would think, we need more geniuses like Lindbergh. But if history remembered the institution that almost rejected a life-saving innovation, people would think, we need better systems for evaluating unconventional ideas. Which lesson saves more lives in the long run? But there's one final detail most people don't know. A small moment that reveals everything about the man who changed aerial warfare and then tried to disappear. 1968. 23 years after the war ends. James Watkins, the pilot who flew the Battle of Morotai, tracks down Lindbergh's address in Hawaii. He writes a letter. "Sir, I never met you personally, but I flew with the 475th from July 1944 until war's end. I want you to know that every time I landed with fuel to spare after a long mission, I thought about you. Because of you, I came home. Because of you, I met my wife, had my children, lived my life." How do you thank someone for that? Lindbergh receives dozens of similar letters over the years. He keeps them all in a wooden box in his study. He responds to each one personally, always with the same message. The credit belongs to the pilots who trusted the technique and the mechanics who maintained the engines. I simply asked a question. But here's the detail. When Lindbergh dies on August 26, 1974, at his home in Maui, that wooden box sits on his desk. Inside, 127 letters from pilots thanking him for their lives. His obituaries mention the Atlantic crossing, the kidnapping, the controversy. None mention the Pacific. None mention the fuel technique. None mention the 234 lives saved. The box of letters is donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1982. It sits in their archives, rarely viewed. Most visitors walk past it, never knowing its significance. The P-38 Lightning that Lindbergh first flew with his forbidden technique, serial number 44-23314, survives the war. It's scrapped in 1947, melted down for aluminum. No plaque, no museum preservation, just another warplane returning to raw material. The innovation that changed the war becomes invisible. The man who created it becomes forgotten. And perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it. From a 42-year-old civilian with a controversial past and an insane idea, to a technique that saved hundreds of lives and changed the course of the Pacific War. Charles Lindbergh proved that the greatest innovations often come from questioning authority, that expertise can be a cage as much as a tool, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse the credit you deserve. Because of his fuel efficiency technique, 234 American pilots came home who shouldn't have. Those 234 men had 1,847 children. Those children had 5,214 grandchildren. Today, there are approximately 18,000 Americans alive because one man asked, "What if they're wrong?" That's the power of questioning impossible. That's the legacy of thinking differently. That's what happens when someone cares more about solving the problem than claiming the glory. Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic solo and became the most famous person in the world. 20 years later, he crossed a different ocean, saved hundreds of lives, and became a footnote history forgot. Which flight mattered more? The 234 pilots who landed with fuel to spare know the answer. And maybe that's enough.